It's great to be here, and I was asked to address a very specific question today, and that is, does Korea need a new regulatory paradigm in order to foster innovation in the Korean AI industry? Well, I'm afraid I'm not an expert in the Korean AI industry, but I have worked in regulatory and governance policy for over 20 years now. So what I hope that I can do for you today is to share some of those insights and some of the experience from the UK and Western European countries in order to suggest some reforms that might help the Korean industry to prosper. So I guess my starting point is to recognize the spectacular technological progress that Korea has made over the last 4 decades. It has transformed itself from a poor, rural agrarian state into a technological powerhouse with the most advanced networked digital infrastructure in the world. And yet, despite this, Korea faces substantial challenges in seeking to grow its AI industry. Well, a number of commentators have identified some of the core challenges facing Korea's tech industry as arising from its excessive dependence on the manufacturing sector, particularly relative to a weak software and services sector. And the nature of the Korean regulatory system is often considered partly to blame for this situation. So my talk is going to consider how the Korean regulatory system might benefit from some reforms in order to help invigorate the current innovation ecosystem in ways that may enhance its capacity to promote entrepreneurship and innovation in this domain, which is going to be essential if the Korean AI industry is to flourish. But again, I emphasize that my expertise and experience lies in the regulatory regimes of Western, liberal, democratic, industrialized economies, and I don't have any particular expertise with the Korean AI industry. So I guess my primary aim here is to consider how some approaches adopted in the UK and Western Europe might actually help to shed light on reforms that the Korean regulatory system might benefit from in order to foster a thriving industry in AI here in Korea. Well, a number of people have identified some of the sources of the failure of the software and services dimension of the Korean tech industry to thrive. And they include a chaebol-dominated economy, characterized by tight vertical integration, in which small and medium-sized enterprises and startups have struggled to gain a foothold and have considerably lower rates of productivity than the large chaebols. Secondly, there's this emphasis on manufacturing rather than the software and services sector. Government intervention and regulatory obstacles are often cited as a real problem. And there are also some cultural barriers, characterized by a highly risk-averse mindset of successful Korean graduates and their fear of failure, who overwhelmingly seek job stability and higher salaries in the chaebol firms than pursuing the risks and rewards associated with tech startups, which requires a more creative entrepreneurial mindset and its concomitant risks. Well, if one takes a broad view of regulation, then it's possible to identify regulatory interventions aimed at addressing each one of these problems. But the focus of my comments today will be on considering the way in which regulatory reform might help to nurture innovation in the software and services sector, particularly for startups and small and medium-sized enterprises, in order to help establish a dynamic and thriving software ecosystem that sits on top of Korea's advanced digital infrastructure. So to identify whether Korea needs a new regulatory paradigm to nurture AI innovation, it's helpful to step back a little bit and think about and understand why is it that new and emerging technologies generate particular challenges for regulators. And these can be understood in terms of several distinct but related problems, which can be thought of in terms of why, when, and how should we regulate. So let's start with the problem of why regulate. Well, when a new technology emerges, we suffer from a pervasive problem of uncertainty. And there's an initial question of whether or not the new technology falls within the scope of regulation at all. But the questions about, or the problems arising from uncertainty are much deeper than just questions of legal jurisdiction, because the uncertainty is pervasive. We simply don't know what the benefits will be, what the risks are. We don't know how society will respond, whether they will take them up and in what ways, how will they use them, what will the broadest social implications of this new technology be. All of this is unknown and highly speculative at the time that a new technology emerges. And this generates some pretty serious challenges for several social actors and institutions. So for regulators, they need to address the question, how should they respond? Should they permit this technology? Should they ban it? Or should they regulate it? And if they decide they should regulate it, in what way should they regulate it? And what would be the purpose? It also generates uncertainty for entrepreneurs and investors who seek regulatory certainty in making investment decisions. And for them, regulatory risk is a serious disincentive for investment. And for the general public and civil society, there will be fears about the potential adverse effects of both the direct and indirect nature associated with the technology that's starting to emerge. Well, in the ICT sector, it's the rapid pace of this innovation that makes these problems of uncertainty even greater. So it's well known that the pace of innovation typically outstrips the capacity of legal and regulatory systems to respond and adapt. This is the so-called problem of regulatory lag, or sometimes called the pacing problem. But this pacing problem is not a new problem associated just with the so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution. Having said that, it's fair to say that the pace of digital innovation, particularly in relation to machine learning techniques, have experienced breathtaking development in the last few years. And although it's fair to say that advances in AI are expected to generate very considerable social benefits, and the speed at which these powerful algorithmic techniques have developed has been fueling public anxiety concerning the potential downsides, the potential harms, or should we say technological risks associated with these developments. And there are those who fear that if we don't act sooner rather than later, then the so-called technological horse will have bolted and it will be too late to intervene in a way that's practically and politically feasible. But identifying the optimal time for regulatory intervention in technological pathways is very difficult. So according to the so-called Collingridge dilemma, technological innovations present regulators with difficult choices about the timing of their intervention. So if they choose to intervene early, then uncertainty about the technology's trajectory, its social take-up, its impact, risks and benefits will be very high. And so inevitably, any early intervention will be based on speculative assumptions that may subsequently turn out to be wrong and unfounded, and this might not only discourage potentially beneficial innovation, but at worst it could in fact be counterproductive. On the other hand, if regulators choose to wait and to intervene only after the technology has been released to the public, then there's the worry that technological lock-in may have occurred and there will be less scope to intervene flexibly and effectively. So this challenge that regulators face in determining when to intervene, if at all, is linked directly to the challenge of determining how to intervene. So I gather that in South Korean legal and regulatory culture, not only does regulatory intervention take place early in the innovation life cycle, but the kind of innovation that takes place within South Korean regulatory culture would be regarded from a Western regulatory perspective as rather heavy-handed in nature, because it typically requires permission or authorization before the technology can be released into the public domain. So in Korea, the problem is not so much one of regulatory lag, but for many, they regard it as a regulatory obstruction, because innovators and entrepreneurs can't release their product to the market unless and until it has received regulatory approval. So as one partner at 500 Startups has commented, he says, in Korea, it's only legal if the law says it's legal, whereas in the USA, it's only illegal if the law says it's illegal. And this is from a venture capitalist based in Silicon Valley. And he goes on, he says, the latter optimizes for innovation, the former optimizes for the status quo. This, he says, is probably the single biggest thing that needs to change. In contrast, many Western pro-market liberal regulatory regimes rest on a presumption of permissibility. So that means that in general, if you have a new invention, you can just put it out there to the public unless there's a specific law that prohibits you from doing so. But having said that, it doesn't necessarily follow that this kind of Western pro-market liberal approach is necessarily better than an ex-ante approach to regulation. Because one of the important advantages of intervening early in this way, particularly when combined with strong state oversight, is that it offers the advantage of strategic coordinated action control, whilst ex-post control does not. So one of the striking features of Korea's technological transformation over the past 4 decades is its extraordinary success in moving from a developmental state in the 1980s, where the state struggled even to provide fixed telephony services, to being a nation with the most highly developed advanced digital infrastructure in the world. And the way this has been achieved here in South Korea has been by according a central role to the state as a major driver of national ICT development, which is capable of assuming a strategic oversight and coordinating role. Whereas by contrast, a laissez-faire market-driven approach, which allows technological innovation to emerge spontaneously in a more haphazard fashion, driven by multiple entrepreneurs in response to economic, political, and social drivers and incentives, performs relatively poorly in delivering public infrastructure. So although Korea's ex-ante regulatory culture has tended to constrain entrepreneurship and innovation, it's not necessarily inferior to a US-style laissez-faire free market approach. And in addition, Silicon Valley's mentality of move fast and break things fails to provide adequate consideration of the wider legitimate stakeholder concerns associated with technological innovation, and which, if not taken into account, can generate public backlash. And it's a mentality that reflects an implicit antagonism towards responsible regulatory oversight that's aimed at finding an acceptable balance between the different rights and interests of various social groups. But having said all of that, imposing regulatory control before a new technology has become available might not always be the best time to intervene. So from the perspective of the broader public interest, sometimes ex-ante regulation will be desirable, particularly for high-risk technological innovations, such as those which operate in safety-critical domains, but sometimes it is not, depending upon the innovation policy goal. So other than for high-risk consumer-facing software products and services, it seems that Korea's ex-ante culture, regulatory culture, seems unnecessarily heavy-handed and unduly hampers innovation and entrepreneurship, particularly for startups and small and medium-sized enterprises. So it seems to me that a new regulatory paradigm may well be needed, one that is more flexible and responsive, and which is still capable of sustaining public trust in the capacity of the regulatory system to ensure that the potential adverse effects associated with tech innovation are properly and effectively managed and mitigated. So I want to conclude my talk then with some suggestions for regulatory reform drawn from the British and Western European experience. So on my understanding of the existing Korean approach to regulation suggests that there are a number of ways in which it's not very well equipped to respond to the regulatory challenges associated with innovation and technology. As one local commentator has observed, Korean legal culture is a positive regulatory system that relies upon legislative technique to list permissible actions while demanding clearness and concreteness. It rests on a rigid bureaucratic approach which copes poorly with the dynamism and creativity that flourishing tech innovation in the software services sector requires. So it seems to me that one of the weaknesses of the existing system is that there's a default presumption in favor of ex-ante intervention, rather than asking on a case-by-case basis whether or not a strongly interventionist approach is warranted. So what might be better is a more responsive evaluation of the magnitude of the risks associated with a new technology, whilst recognising that this is inevitably speculative. So my first recommendation is that the Korean system seek to adopt a more flexible, risk-based approach instead of a general approach that requires regulatory permission before a new technology can be publicly released, supplemented with a general liability and sanctioning regime to ensure quality and safety. So if a particular technological innovation is considered high risk, then it would continue to require regulatory permission before it could be brought to the public. But if the innovation in question is a low-risk service or product, understood in terms of the risk priorities of the Korean community, then prior regulatory approval would not be required before that technology can be released to the market. But in order to ensure that the general public is adequately protected, this would need to be supplemented by putting in place legal provisions that mandate minimum quality and safety requirements, subject to monetary penalties for non-compliance, and which would confer on those harmed by the products and services that fail to conform to those minimum quality and safety standards some kind of right to compensation for the resulting harm. So this new approach would be quite different to what is currently in place in two significant respects. Firstly, low-risk software innovations would no longer need prior authorization before release onto the market, and so this would remove a significant regulatory obstacle. Secondly, in order to ensure that the public is properly protected from potential harm, it would place on developers and manufacturers a legal obligation to ensure that their products and services complied with minimum standards of quality and safety. So in other words, this approach would rely heavily on industry self-assessment, shifting the burden of evaluating the quality and safety of the innovation onto the developers and manufacturers, rather than requiring the regulator to undertake a case-by-case evaluation and grant authorization prior to public release. Well, there is some evidence that the Korean regulatory system is taking some small steps in this direction. So, for example, the abolition of the mandatory software certification verification procedure for e-commerce in May 2014, as well as the Special Act on the Promotion and Convergence of ICT Act, which adopts the default of permission in principle for ICT converging technologies, in which prohibition is exceptional. So if there's continued movement in this direction, the general approach would be to place greater legal responsibility on developers and small and medium-sized enterprises themselves to identify what their legal obligations are and to adopt measures that would ensure that they are compliant with these quality and safety standards. But because fear of penalties or lawsuits for non-compliance might deter innovators, it may be important also to introduce measures to offer some assistance to small firms and to startups to help them understand what compliance with these mandatory quality and safety standards actually requires. And so we might need to enhance the availability of information concerning regulatory requirements to provide these firms with direct support so that they can understand better what compliance requires. And so this leads to my second set of recommendations for reform, which lies in implementing measures that will provide this kind of assistance to firms so that they can understand their legal obligations and what steps they might need to take in order to comply with them. So here I have two suggestions. The first is that regulators might promulgate and publish administrative guidance that can provide more detailed guidance to firms concerning the meaning and scope of these quality and safety requirements and the concrete measures that firms can take to ensure that they meet those requirements. And secondly, to provide funding for seeking independent legal advice, particularly for startups and small firms, so to avoid the regulator itself going too far in offering advice to firms themselves. But what if the innovation in question is not high risk and it's not low risk? In other words, what happens if it falls into the category of medium risk devices or software? Well, it's here that my third suggestion for regulatory reform arises, and that is to adopt an experimental approach to regulatory reform in which new software products and services are given provisional permission to operate in a kind of protected environment within an experimental monitored space known as a regulatory sandpit or sandbox. So a good example of this concept is provided by the UK's Financial Conduct Authority, which opened a regulatory sandbox in 2016. And so here the FCA, which is the financial services regulator, provides UK fintech entrepreneurs with a safe space in which they can experiment with innovative products, services and business models, and have actual content with retail consumers and business customers, but without incurring all of the normal regulatory consequences of engaging in such an activity. So the core idea of these sandboxes is to provide a kind of laboratory for development in order to demonstrate the viability and, I guess, safety of these new fintech models, services and techniques. And so it allows early development to occur with direct consumers and business partners, but always subject to a protected environment where there's been ethical approval granted by the regulator, an agreed protocol, provisional licensing, and the regulator continues to have detailed oversight of the tests as they continue throughout the sandbox period. So in this way, it allows these products and services to be tested in virtual and real situations, but without the threat of destabilizing financial systems or jeopardizing consumer protection. So to conclude then, I think South Korea's transformation into a high-tech powerhouse has been something quite extraordinary and demonstrates the success of its innovation system in establishing the networked infrastructure that is critical for AI technologies and the so-called fourth industrial revolution to flourish. But if this tech potential is to be realized here in Korea, then it may benefit from reforming its regulatory system in order to nurture entrepreneurship and innovation, particularly by startups and small and medium-sized enterprises in the software and services sector. And so while the hands-on direct coordinating role played by the Korean government has been critical to the success of Korea's technological transformation, its role now needs to shift to shaping the framework conditions within which innovation emerges and to coordinating and facilitating among the broader networks of actors and policies in order to foster the most conducive possible environment for responsible innovation. So the reform proposals that I've suggested are ultimately aimed at changing the regulatory culture here in Korea. The aim is to move away from a rigid, bureaucratic and highly formalized approach to a more flexible, responsible regulatory culture that would enable innovation to be released to the public more quickly, cheaply and easily. This would require opening up the forms and channels of communication between regulators, between regulated firms, and between civil society and the public generally, one that relies on more dialogue between these parties in a way that will enable firms themselves to be trusted to assume greater responsibilities and the capacity to understand what compliance requires, and the general public can continue to have confidence that the regulatory regime will provide adequate protection against potential harms associated with technological innovation. Thank you.